Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black History for Beginners by Denise, narrated by Janina Edwards. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. Martin Luther King, August 28, 1963. When Washington crossed the Delaware, 2 blacks were with him. Black history? That must mean great ancient Africa, the kingdom of Kush, the Quito dynasty, Songhai and Timbuktu, Solomon and Sheba. No, African history and Black history aren't necessarily the same. Black history is a separate branch of African history that extends beyond its borders. Black history is the American history that was omitted from your textbooks. Aesop, St. Augustine, and Pushkin were of African heritage. There are people of African descent throughout the world, from Indonesia to the Soviet Union. But those who have waged the most enduring struggle for their rights are blacks in the nation that was founded on civil liberties, freedom, and equality, the United States of America. The Black quest in the United States has been the litmus paper on which the proclaimed ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution have been tested. The results indicate that liberty and justice for all has been more fancy than fact. The Explorers. Blacks were in the New World before Columbus arrived. They participated in the first explorations. Blacks were in Cortez's crew in Mexico, with Pizarro in Peru and Alvarado in Quito. When Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean, 30 blacks were with him, including Nuflo de Olano. When Alarcon and Coronado conquered New Mexico, blacks were with them, too. The best known of the black conquistadors was Estebanico. He initiated the opening of New Mexico and Arizona for Spain. If there are misunderstandings between black and white people today, it's because misconceptions about blacks have been allowed to thrive. The only way to help abolish stereotypes is to present a more complete picture of black people in history. Native Americans in the Chicago area claimed that the first white man to settle at Chicago was a Negro. Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, a black man who came to the Mississippi Valley with French explorers, founded the city of Chicago by constructing the first building on the site that developed into the Windy City. It's inspiring to know that blacks made a triumphant entrance into the Western world, but considering the circumstances of millions of blacks today, something went wrong. Something called slavery. The first challenge. The Afro-European slave trade began in 1441 when a Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, sought wealth from Africa and Asia. Henry sent a mariner, Antonio Gonçalves, to the west coast of Africa near Cape Bojador to investigate. Gonçalves brought gold dust and 10 Africans back to Lisbon for the prince as a display of Africa's wealth. The prince gave the Africans to the Pope. The Pope, in turn, granted Henry title to lands discovered east of Cape Blanco. Portugal dominated this area near Senegal, and with it, the African trade market, for nearly a century. A papal bull prevented Spain from going into Africa, but did give her the bulk of the New World. Spain contracted other nations to procure slaves for her. The contract was called an asiento and was a symbol of power. By 1460, approximately 600 slaves were entering Portugal annually. In Lisbon, blacks outnumbered whites. The Portuguese didn't invent slavery. For example, the ancient Greeks kept slaves, and Moses led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. On the west coast of the Dark Continent, a slave system was initiated and perpetuated for economic purposes. The commercial revolution offered carte blanche to those who sought to exploit in order to rise on the social and economic ladder. There were 3 distinct stages on the journey from Africa to the New World. 1. Capture and conditioning in Africa. 2. The sea voyage or Middle Passage. 3. Seasoning in the West Indies. European traders rationalized that slavery was a holy cause because it introduced heathens to Christianity. The roots of the slave trade. The captured were members of various tribes. They were kidnapped or captured in tribal wars and sold. European traders established posts along the West African coastline, where beads, guns, whiskey, and ivory were bartered for bodies. Men and women could be purchased from independent African slaves, too. Chiefs often appointed a cabocier, an African who gathered those who were to be sold. The slaves and the cabocier led the capture in the long march to the coastline. Those who were best fit physically were sought, the strong, brave, and healthy. After the long march, the captured, chained 2 by 2, were taken to Negro houses or prison. The strongest were branded with the stamp of the trading company. Incarceration in the Negro house was followed by the chained march to the ship for the transatlantic voyage. The journey lasted from 8 to 10 weeks. Many of the captured attempted to escape by jumping overboard. Others refused to eat. A slave ship's crew member often broke the teeth of the hunger strikers and force-fed them. Loss of a black life meant loss of revenue. The captured shared no common language. Some went mad in the claustrophobic quarters. Others murdered those next to them in order to gain space. Ship captains estimated that they would lose a percentage of African cargo in death via escape, suffocation, or illness. There was even insurrection insurance. The seasoning period lasted from 3 to 4 years. Backs and spirits were broken in order to transform the Africans into American slaves. They were trained by other slaves or by whites who had experience in breaking in even the most rebellious arrivals. Each slave was given a work assignment, repeating a task for 12 hours each day. Any inclination towards suicide was beaten out of them. The death rate was high during the seasoning period because of the inability of slaves to adjust to the food or climate. Absentee landlordism was responsible for the excess of brutality towards the slaves. Plantation owners entrusted their lands to overseers who saw slaves as beasts of burden. In the 16th century, 887,500 slaves were imported. In the 17th, 2,750,000. In the 18th, 7 million. And in the 19th, 3,250,000. Slaves worked the sugar crop, which was shipped to New England, processed into rum, and then used to purchase more slaves in Africa. Europeans turned the Caribbean into a slave-making factory. By 1724, there were 32,000 blacks to 14,000 whites in Jamaica. The high percentage of blacks gave rise to the strict black codes. The white populace feared insurrection, knowing that in numbers they were at a disadvantage. The sooner a slave accepted his or her helplessness, the better for those who sought to exploit. In 1667, British Parliament adopted an act to regulate the Negroes on the British plantations. The Black Codes. Highlights of this act. 1. If a slave owner beats his slaves to death or kills one by mistake, there shall be no legal repercussions. 2. All slaves must carry a pass at all times. 3. Slaves shall be whipped or branded on the face if they strike a Christian. 4. Christians are not held responsible for destroying personal property. Slaves. Black codes, slave codes, states' rights, Jim Crow laws, segregation, racial discrimination, home rule. What do these words really mean? Fear and greed, which created the first codes, remained and existed throughout time. 1667. The fear. High percentage of imported blacks and possible revolts. The solution? Black codes. 1822, 1831. The fear. Slaves like Vesey and Nat Turner rebel and kill whites. The solution? Slave codes. 1865. The fear. Post-Civil War slaveholders in South want to remain master. The solution. Home rule. 1886. The fear. Rutherford B. Hayes needs Southern votes to win election. The solution. States' rights. 1896. The fear. Homer Plessy challenges legality of separate but equal railroad cars. The solution. Jim Crow laws. 1890s. The fear. Blacks try to better their lives using the ballot, education, organization, and protest. The solution. Segregation and discrimination. The plantation owners and overseers had reason to fear the slaves rising against them, because slaves fought back whenever possible. In 1522, there was a rebellion on the island of Santo Domingo, and in 1526, the slaves in a settlement, which was to become South Carolina, revolted from the 500 Spaniards who held them. Some of the blacks escaped to Haiti. Others took refuge with Native Americans. Uprisings continued sporadically until the slaves were freed in the 19th century. The outstanding resistors of the black codes were Cudjoe, a runaway slave in 18th century Jamaica, and Mankandal in Haiti. Both men led a group of runaways on their respective islands known as the Maroons. The Maroons lived in the island mountains and ignited revolts among the slaves. They gnawed at the planters' repressive system and intensified their fears. Now, back to England in 1655. Portugal was unable to maintain control of the slave trade. By 1655, England had won Jamaica from Spain, and by the 18th century held the Asiento. England dominated the industry. She supplied her colonies with slaves and indentured servants. The latter worked from 4 to 7 years, at which time they were free to work for themselves. Some were white ex-convicts from English prisons. Slave trade centers shifted to places like Liverpool, England, and Newport, Rhode Island. The West Indies were depleted by constant sugar production. The soil was used up, and consequently, the continents of North and South America became the primary production centers. In North America, tobacco was the attractive item, as it had been in the Caribbean. England, France, Holland, and colonial America received double stimulation from the slave trade, making profits both on the goods produced by slave labor and on the manufacture of instruments used to coerce and control them. By the late 1700s, many slave ships were sailing directly to America from Africa. Major markets were set up in Newport, Rhode Island, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In the beginning, slavery wasn't confined to the southern colonies. New Netherlands was founded by the Dutch West India Company, whose traffic was slaves. New York recognized slavery as legal in 1684. New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania sanctioned the business too. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island condoned slavery. In the North, slaves worked as house servants, unskilled laborers, and skilled painters, carpenters, smiths, and potters. Although the northern geography was not appropriate for the agricultural production that characterized the southern plantation, there were farms in the north that utilized slave labor. In the New England colonies, blacks were not more than 3% of the population, with the exception of Rhode Island, where they accounted for 10%. The slave codes in each of the colonies north and south were either severe or lenient, depending on the percentage of blacks in the colony. New England was the best place to be if you were a black slave. Unlike the southern slave owners, New England colonists placed no legal restrictions on educating slaves. Slaves were guaranteed a fair trial, were allowed to testify against whites, and could sue. The colonies. In 1619, 2 black men, Antony and Pedro, a black woman, Isabella, and 17 additional blacks arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. They'd been stolen twice, once from Africa, then from a Spanish cargo vessel en route to the Caribbean. A Dutch man-of-war took them from the Spanish and delivered them to Jamestown. In 1624, a couple from that group were married. Their son, William Tucker, was the first black child born in the British colonies. Taking their cue from the West Indies, Virginia planters began to appreciate the advantages in holding blacks to a lifetime of slavery. Black babies, unlike William Tucker, would be born with no opportunity for freedom. Let me figure this. 1 slave lifetime minus minimum care costs plus 1 tobacco field minus seed and crop transport equals unlimited profit. In 1662, a Virginia law stated that a newborn was or was not free depending on the status of his mother. Virginia subtly established statutes undermining the Negro population. For example, black servants were required to remain in service after their indentured time was over. Baptism failed to alter or alleviate the slave's condition. According to the Virginia legislature, conferring of baptisms doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and the Carolinas adopted a similar policy by the early 1700s. Spiritually, however, Christianity did offer them hope, if not consolation. Black slaves absorbed the positive essence of Christianity, faith and belief in an eventual promised land on earth, fed their imaginations and enabled them to persevere. The mournfully deep spirituals express both personal emotions and understanding of the scriptures. Biblical allusions are consistent throughout the melodies. Spirituals like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and Deep River betray overwhelming sorrow, such that death and the afterlife are perceived as joyous release. The African musical heritage served more than a religious purpose. African influences are united in the conga, rumba, and mambo. The tango is based on African rhythmic patterns, and its name is a derivate of an African word, tangana. Brazil's samba is a descendant of the kizomba, the wedding dance of Angola. Meanwhile, up north, Christian righteousness prevailed. Puritanism, which was originally synonymous with radicalism, and the Quaker faith were the liberal left of the colonies. The Quakers. George Keith of Philadelphia and his friends in the Society published the first anti-slavery document in the British colonies, 1693. Even before this, in 1688, the Germantown protest took place, during which Quakers formally spoke against slavery. Among the Quakers, who were decidedly against slavery, were the Society's founder, George Fox, Pennsylvania's founder, William Penn, and John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, who wrote, printed, and distributed anti-slavery literature. Benezet taught white people about the religious and moral ills of slavery. He taught blacks reading and writing in his Philadelphia school. There were Quakers in the South, North Carolina as well. By 1770, they were urging slaveholders to put an end to the iniquitous practice. Quakers were the original freedom riders. A curious situation developed in New York City. In 1741, word of mouth spread a report that blacks and poor whites were uniting to overtake the city. Earlier, in 1712, 23 armed slaves had set fire to a slave owner's house in New York City. A full-scale insurrection followed, in which 10 whites were killed or injured, and 21 blacks were tried, convicted, and executed. Fear of the new alliance was so great that the city offered rewards for names. Subsequently, 200 blacks and whites were arrested. 18 blacks were hanged, 13 were burned alive, 4 whites, 2 of them women, were hanged. Efforts to divide these two groups and set them in competition for jobs, training, and educational opportunities have persisted throughout American history. American Revolution. On the eve of the American Revolution, there were slaves in all 13 colonies. Pennsylvania, with its strong Quaker influence, was regarded as the most humane and decent colony in respect to blacks. In 1780, It became the first state to abolish slavery. Crispus Attucks of Massachusetts was one of the first to fall, and much has been made of that fact. But blacks and the American Revolution was more complex than a matter of one black man being shot at the beginning. From New England, Abigail Adams pointed out to her revolutionary husband, "It has always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Some blacks like Gershom Prince of Pennsylvania had already fought for the colonies in the French and Indian War of 1763. Blacks were for America. They sided with the Patriots against the Loyalists. They were involved in the Stamp Act riots, when British troops were sent to Boston to intimidate the citizenry. Blacks were among those who drove them out. Black revolutionaries. Many blacks fought at Bunker Hill, among them Prince Hall, P. Salem, and Salem Poor. Of Poor, the following commendation was made by his officers: "An experienced officer, as well as an excellent soldier, in the person of this said Negro centers a brave and gallant soldier." A number of colonial legislatures passed their own anti-slave trade measures. Rhode Island and Connecticut in 1774. Any slave entering Rhode Island was automatically free. In 1773, Pennsylvania chose to put a 20-pound duty on each imported slave, which strongly discouraged trade. In the South, where fears were greatest, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia passed laws which restricted the trade. These measures were a reaction to the vast number of physically fit blacks whose power could be overwhelming. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson spoke against slavery in his indictment of George III. "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him." If there was any doubt about the route slavery would take if the Revolution succeeded, that doubt was erased by the Continental Congress's reaction to the anti-slavery clause. The Southern delegates, whose livelihood depended on slaves as both investments and laborers, perked up their ears when the clause was read. They refused to sign a declaration that made black slaves free and equal. The Continental Congress needed to present a united front. Without the Southern delegates, it would have been weakened. The anti-slavery cause was not sufficient reason to lose them. In order to pacify the Southern delegates and sustain the Union, the clause was excised. Great Britain was inextricably tied up with slavery. Some colonials wanted to decrease or end importation and presented their plea to the king. But Parliament viewed slavery as a lucrative business and saw no reason to antagonize British shippers. The fear of possible uprisings proved to be an obstacle when it came to enlisting blacks for the American struggle. In spite of the role of blacks in the French and Indian War and early battles with British troops, General George Washington issued an order that "any stroller, Negro, or vagabond will not be recruited for service," July 6, 1775. The British were more shrewd. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, issued another order freeing all indentured servants who would join His Majesty's service. By January 1776, Washington issued another statement: "All blacks who have already served may re-enlist." In Virginia alone, 31,000 or more slaves ran away. Masters did all they could to block them. After the war, the British evacuated more than 10,000 Negroes who set sail for England, despite Washington's objections. By the end of the war, 5,000 blacks had served on the American side. Because free blacks were preferable to armed slaves, the majority of those who served were from the North. Founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush spoke against slavery after the war, as did many others. Some progress was made. 1780 to 1786, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey passed manumission, Freedom from Slavery, Acts. 1787. Congress added a provision to the Northwest Ordinance that slavery could not exist in territories under the ordinance. The Constitutional Convention, however, dealt anti-slavery hopes a painful blow. Slavery was recognized by the convention. The pro-slavery sentiments were so strong that Ben Franklin did not even attempt to read the Pennsylvania Abolition Society's statement. Negro men were considered 3/5 of a person in the Constitution, which made their representation dubious. In phrasing the articles about slavery, the Congress was careful not to use the word slavery, but the ambiguous persons held to service. They knew that slavery was an anathema, so they painted it in euphemisms to ease their consciences and to deceive history. At the same time, it firmly established them as less than equal. Worse, it established the majority of Negroes in the South as property, and precautions were taken to protect them as investments. The Constitutional Congress extended slavery 20 years, as stipulated in Article 2, Section 9. Slavery shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. Finally, one more blow. Article 4. Congress passed a law which required states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. The war rhetoric and the Quaker regard for human rights had little influence on the designers of the United States. By 1790, the total investment in slaves was $104,639,000. Government should rest on the dominion of property. U.S. Congress, 1790. Or, as Calvin Coolidge said about 150 years later, the business of America is business. In the aftermath of the War for Independence, the plight of blacks had not changed. The North began to steer towards the Industrial Revolution. The South continued its slave-sustained agricultural direction. The majority of Negroes in the North were free, but 89% of the South's black population were slaves. For a while, it seemed that slavery might die because tobacco was no longer in demand. Industrially advanced England was opening doors for a new product, cotton. Machines to spin and weave raw cotton fiber revolutionized manufacturing. Cotton seed had to be separated from the fiber before it could be used. The southern soil was a natural for growing cotton. Cultivating it required the kind of monotonous labor masters thought ideal for slaves. Busy slaves meant that their investments in human lives would be saved, property protected. Southern planters needed to find a way to separate those cotton seeds. In 1793, a Northern teacher seeking employment in Dixie found a solution to the technical problem. Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton king and accelerated human bondage. New England merchants provided slaves for Southern plantations. The violation of black woman slaves was not illegal. If a man molested a slave belonging to another, then the crime was in damaging the property. The children of mixed unions kept the status of their mothers slaves. Some slaveholders kept their own offspring in perpetual servitude, while others freed them. Archibald McMillan freed a woman and her 5 children. For the faithful service she has rendered me, the others I free on account of believing them to be my own children. By the 1870s, many newly freed slaves had more white than Negro blood. Thomas Jefferson devised a mathematical formula to determine what percentage of Negro blood made a child of mixed parentage a Negro. The categories divided into mulatto, half, quadroon, 1/4, octoroon, 1/8. There were 2 groups of slaves, those in the field and those in the main house. This created a hierarchy. The slave who held most authority was the driver, who worked for the overseer. His job was to supervise the field hands, making sure they worked incessantly, punishing idlers with a whip. Field slaves worked long hours under the sun. They lived in huts and slept on mats on the floor, and had 2 sets of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?